One Thursday night, just a few years ago, the telephone rang. It was Gert. She was the person that my sister and I had hired to take care of my father down in Talladega, Alabama, ever since our mother had died. She called to say Mr. George was really sick and I probably should come on home. My daddy was a strong man. He'd lived his life taking care of things. When my sister Patsy died of cancer, he took care of her right up to the very end. And then when my mother died, just a few years after that, he spent his life taking care of her over those last years until he finally just ran out of people to take care of. And he started going downhill himself. That's when my other sister Alice and I hired Gert to move into his home and help take care of him. I didn't know exactly what to do. It was late Thursday night. I was a minister. I couldn't just take off and leave without making lots of phone calls. I could arrange everything and I could leave that night and get there sometime, 2 or 3 in the morning maybe. It was about a 5-hour trip. Or I could wait and get up real early in the morning, about 5 o'clock, and get home about 10 o'clock in the morning. And by the time I got everything taken care of, I decided that's what I was going to do, because my father was a strong man. I got up early that morning and I was driving across northern Mississippi on my way home, and I remember thinking to myself, I know that my father loves me, and I know that he knows I love him. So if I don't get there in time to tell him, it will be okay. And I spent those hours driving just remembering my father, remembering the stories he'd told and the things that I remembered about him and his life. Long before I was ever born, he and his brother Leon had run a little resort outside of Talladega. He had hired this woman to be his bookkeeper. He said she was so bad at it, but he felt so sorry for her that he couldn't fire her, so he married her. And that was my mama. Anybody that knew my daddy would know several things about him. One of the things that they'd know about him was that he was a good businessman. He really studied his investments. He might not have much money, but he was going to invest it wisely. Whenever he bought, say, some stocks, he not only kept up with what those stocks did, but he also kept up with the stocks that he didn't buy, so he would know if he could have done better. Anybody that knew my daddy would also know that he always smoked a pipe. Oh, my daddy always had a pipe in his mouth. And it seemed to be hard work to keep that pipe going because he was always working at it. He only smoked Granger rough-cut tobacco. It came in purple cans with a yellow tobacco leaf on it. And we had hundreds of those cans saved up around the house to keep nuts and bolts and everything you can imagine inside those cans. You'd also know that my daddy had a tremble. They never really did diagnose it, but he always shook. He'd hold the bowl of that pipe in his hand, and he'd hold the stem of that pipe in his mouth, and he'd try to talk to you, and his hands would shake, and the stem would rattle against his teeth, and you had to lean in real close just to even hear what he was saying. My daddy left me 2 pieces of advice. If you tailgate long enough, sooner or later you're going to run into something. And diversify. That was my daddy's advice. Anybody that knew my daddy would also know he was a hard-working man. When he ran that resort at Chaco Springs outside of Talladega, he was always the last person in bed at night and always the first person up in the morning. He said he always loved that early morning time, 3:30 or 4 in the morning when he was up by himself. He'd fix himself a breakfast and eat it. That was his quiet time of the day. When World War II broke out, He and his brother sold that resort and enlisted in the Army. My daddy went to basic training in Miami, Florida, with Clark Gable and Bobby Jones, the golfer. When he finished basic training, his commanding officer, my daddy says, called him in and sat him down and said, "George, I've got your record here in front of me, and I see you've done a good job, but there is one thing on your record that I simply don't understand, and I hope you can explain it to me." My father said, "What's that?" And the commanding officer said, "George, you're the only person ever to go through basic training and gain weight." My daddy claims he said, "Frankly, sir, I found it kind of restful." He was a hard-working man. And when I got born right after World War II and started growing up, it was clear to me pretty soon that he was raising me to be a hard-working person too. About the time I was in the 2nd grade, my daddy bought a farm. He already had a full-time job running an insurance agency in town, but I figure he must have needed another full-time job to do after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And when he would come home for lunch during the summers and I was there, I knew he was going to give me some chores to do that afternoon. And one of the chores I remember that was his favorite chore to give me to do was to pull the nutgrass out of the brick walk around our house. My daddy had a lifelong war with nutgrass. If you don't understand nutgrass, let me explain it to you. It's a hardy grass. It's green. It's respectable like any other kind of grass, I thought, but my daddy hated it. The green grass went down to a root underground, but on that root there was a nut. So right away you got a problem when you're pulling it up, because you're pulling that nut up through the dirt, and it's pulling back against you. And if you don't get that nut, you hadn't really pulled up the grass. But it's even worse than that, because underground, out of that nut, more roots are growing out in every direction, making more nuts, sending up more nutgrass. In theory, I figured if I was good enough at it, I could grab one piece of nutgrass and start pulling, and every bit of nutgrass in Talladega County would come up right at my feet. But of course, I wasn't that good at it, and that never happened, and he had me pulling it up between bricks on our walkway around our house, which meant using an ice pick or a screwdriver, and it meant bloody knuckles. It was a terrible job. Of course, it wasn't all work on our farm. We had fun, too. I can remember days when we would make homemade ice cream. My mama would mix up the recipe and pour it in the silver cylinder. Now, we didn't have any kind of electric ice cream maker. We were hard-working people. We cranked our ice cream. My daddy would put ice around that cylinder and salt in there to lower the temperature. It'd stay water below 32 degrees, and we'd start cranking. And sometimes he'd lay newspapers on the top of it, and I'd get to sit on the top of it while he cranked and cranked, and sometimes I got to crank it until it got tough and hard to turn, and then we would very carefully lift that cylinder out so as not to get any of that salt water in the ice cream, and my daddy would go off and pour off the salt water. One day he told me, "You go pour off the salt water." But as I took that bucket of salt water off the porch, he said to me, "Now be careful. Don't you pour that salt water on anything that's growing, because salt water will kill anything that grows." That was a great day in my life. I discovered how to keep nutgrass from ever appearing between the bricks of that walk. Anytime I saw a little sprig of green coming up, I was out there with salt water. My daddy never saw any more nutgrass, so he ran out of that chore to give me to do. But he taught me how to drive the tractor. As soon as I was big enough for my feet to reach the clutch and the brake, my daddy taught me how to drive the tractor. I can still remember the feel of him standing on the back of that tractor with his arms around my shoulders and my hands and his hands on the steering wheel, and him teaching me how to make that tractor go and stop. I can remember trips to the cemetery with my daddy. he would show me the graves where his daddy and his mama were buried and where Aunt Willie was buried. And lots of times he'd take along cuttings from our yard, from our nandinas and boxwoods, and even from the pine trees, and he'd decorate their grave sites. And I'd ask him why he did that, and he said, "'Cause that's what families do. They take care of each other, whether they're dead or alive." I can remember Friday nights sitting in my daddy's lap, watching the Friday night fights with him, the Gillette Friday night fights, and I can remember the stubble of his cheek against my clean little boy cheek. I thought about all those things as I drove across Mississippi and Alabama heading toward home. And I thought to myself, I know my daddy loves me. And I know my daddy knows I love him. But I sure hope I get there in time to tell him. I pulled in the driveway and I went in the house. When I walked in the door, I saw Gert sitting on the sofa in the den, and I knew I had not gotten there in time. If my daddy had been alive, Gert would have been sitting by his bedside. She said to me he died about 8:30 this morning, just about an hour and a half before I got there. She'd already called my wife at home and my sister Alice in Nashville, and they'd be coming down later in the day. Dr. Davis had come by and pronounced him dead, and the funeral home had already come and taken his body away. I didn't know what to do or what to say. Suddenly I thought, well, I need to go see his room. I need to go see where he died. So I got up and I walked to his bedroom and I stood in the door. And not only was he gone, but the hospital bed we had rented for him was already gone too. In a small town like Talladega, it doesn't take long for things to happen. And I looked into that bedroom and I saw that great empty space there. And I felt like I was standing on the edge of some sort of deep hole, and I might fall in. And I reached over and I sort of held on to the door. Well, pretty soon friends started to arrive. Some of them brought food by. We started remembering and telling stories and things like that, and then Alice came from Nashville, and my wife Lyda came with our children, and Alice and I started looking around the house. Suddenly we realized this is all ours now. And she wanted to find Dad's army trunk. We started looking all over that house for the trunk where he had stored things from when he was in the Army Air Force during World War II. We looked everywhere there was to look, but we couldn't find it. There weren't that many places to look because my folks had moved into this smaller house and there were just a few closets and, oh yeah, there was an attic. We pulled down the steps in the hall there between the bedrooms, climbed up in the attic. Well, just a small part of the attic even had a floor in it, and there were just a few things up there in the attic and no army trunk. The more we looked, the madder my sister Alice got. She remembered when she went off to college and our mother had thrown away her entire comic book collection. She threw out his army trunk, she said. We went to bed that night with Alice mad at our mother for throwing out our father's army trunk. The next morning when we woke up, Alice came out of her bedroom on one side of the hall and I came out of my bedroom on the other, and she said, "Did you hear it?" And I said, "What?" She said, "Somebody was walking around in the attic last night." I said, "Alice, nobody was walking around in the attic last night. We would have heard them if they'd pulled down these steps right between our two doors. How could anybody be walking around in the attic? She says, I don't know, but I heard it all night long, and furthermore, she said, they were walking down at that end of the attic, and she pointed down toward the kitchen and the carport. I said, Alice, the attic is not even floored down there. It's impossible. Nobody could have been walking down there at all. And then I thought, unless there's something over the carport. And the two of us went through the kitchen to the carport door and opened it and looked up in the ceiling of the carport. And over in the corner was something neither one of us had ever noticed before about that house. There was a little cutout. I went and got the stepladder. And I climbed up and I lifted the panel out of that cutout, and I took a flashlight and I shined it up there and I said, it's floored up here, and there is one thing up here. The army trunk. I can't tell you what was going on in the attic that night. I can't explain it. The only thing I know is that's what families do. They take care of each other, whether they're dead or alive.